I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me.
I have to say, I went through the show notes, Tobias, and I am very scared because this is 17 pages. And we said we weren't going to do that to each other anymore. You broke our promise, Tobias.
I was on a train. I got carried away.
You wrote your thesis. I mean, for crying out loud. But it's a lot. It's too much.
This is the problem, Radha, is that we're recording unusually late, and I've turned off my work brain and gone into like dad brain for the last few hours, and now you're asking me to put back on my work brain, where I have to pick up sarcasm.
I mean, that's just always what I am. So just figure it out.
All right, so some updates. First of all, on solar. So we did an episode a little while ago about Australia's slight issue with an overabundance problem of solar energy, where one of the ways of resolving that was to allow electricity to be free in the middle of the day as a way of artificially increasing demand. And it looks like humble Britain will face the same problem this year, actually.
Yoink.
The UK is going to ask Brits to increase their electricity demand this summer. On the 7th of April, which is about 3 weeks ago as we record, the UK generated a record 14.4 megawatts of solar. And I'm happy to tell you, it's been bloody glorious the last few weeks. So I can only imagine that number has increased since the 7th of April as well. And then one quick one on Polymarket. I'm sure everyone's seen in the news, there's been a bunch of stories, particularly around the Iran war and the idea that there's insider trading of strategic or military information going on. And it's sort of slightly more mundane but equally shocking story. There's been suspicion that an individual has been tampering with a weather station at Paris's Charles de Gaulle airport to make about $500,000 on betting on the weather.
See, this is what I was afraid of, and it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, it's happening really fast as well.
Yeah.
From like, this is potentially disastrous to it's actually happening. There's actually some video footage of this individual going up to the weather station at the sort of edge of a runway in Charles de Gaulle Airport using a portable hairdryer hunched
That's
over the
not
weather
great.
sensor. Doing the temperature. Yeah. And in cars, Waymo who have just launched in the UK, are currently being sued by a cyclist in San Francisco after a Waymo pulled into the bike lane right in front of them and they crashed into the back of it. When they were confronted by cycling advocates about this, one of the executives at Waymo said that expecting the car to respect bike lanes is, quote, too high a bar because customers expect to be dropped off in them.
I am genuinely shocked. I am shocked for humanity, I think. I have an update that is maybe good, maybe positive. I don't know. So we just did an episode on doom tourism. There is an update that the local community of Lahaina, which is on the island of Maui in Hawaii. So the quote here is, organizers' greatest victory, and there's this community, the grassroots organization called Lahaina Strong, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. Their greatest victory so far comes after years of talks with the mayor and local officials. In December, the city council passed a law to phase out 7,000 rentals on the island, which is 15% of the island's housing stock, to house fire survivors and other locals. Now, the context here is that this part of Maui has been ravaged by the deadly fires in 2023, by recent storms, by ice raids, and one of the organizers from this grassroots group, Lahaina Strong, said that so many community members are just hanging on by a thread. I think it's interesting to see that Maui is trying to, rebuild, not to bring in tourists, but actually to prioritize locals.
Radha, how jazzed are you by spaceflight?
I think like everyone, I watched the Artemis, what is it called? The Journey, the thing. I do find...
Watch the thing, do the thing.
I watch the thing with my kids because like we were all kind of into it. I do think it's a little bit hubrisy to think that like human beings have the right to be out there in space, to colonize the moon, to extract material. There are some kind of ethical nuances that I'm not so comfortable with around our space exploration, but
But there's a sort of glory to it, isn't there? You describe watching it. It feels momentous when you have these events. So we're obviously referencing the successful launch and now return of Artemis II.
Yeah.
A week or two ago. It feels momentous, doesn't it? It feels like a milestone. It feels significant. I feel about it the same way as I sort of feel about the royal family in a way, where it's like, this feels wasteful, but I enjoy the fact that it's happening.
I was waiting to see what direction that was going to go, and I was like, is he a monarchist?
So Artemis II launched and has now returned and arguably kicks off a new space race, or at least that sort of ambition of the US government and the Chinese government in particular, that we're kicking off a new space race. But this space race is kind of different. It's built in a different commercial, socioeconomic context. It's not built in the midst of a Cold War. The existential geopolitical posturing between China and the US has a very different flavour to the one between the Soviet Union and the US. And obviously the technology's changed and the nature of technological research and innovation has changed. So I thought it'd be interesting to just unpick a little bit of like the context for the Artemis program and some of the competitors out there, including the Chinese and joint Chinese and Russian program, and then speculate a little bit on, okay, what does a new space age look like if we think about the impacts of the last space race on our collective technoculture, everything from computers to gaffer tape? What does this one start to look like? So very brief history of the Artemis program. So George Bush called a reset of the US space ambitions after the Columbia shuttle disaster. They announced a thing called the Vision for Space Exploration, the idea being to restore public legitimacy to NASA, and they created a thing called the Constellation Program, the aim of which was to return humans to the moon as a staging post to Mars, and that is a thing that has stuck. The idea is we've done the moon, that's fine. What the moon gives us actually is a staging post for further solar system exploration or cislunar exploration, because once you've got stuff off the Earth and onto the moon, the gravity's a lot lower, and so it's a lot cheaper to get stuff off and on and off the moon than it is to get stuff on and off Earth, which is obviously also, as we've discussed before, very complex because it has weather and satellites and things like that. 2010, Obama cancelled the Constellation program. But some of the hardware stuck around and became what's called the Space Launch System and Orion, which is basically the US's cargo capability to get stuff into space. Zilch until 2017. Donald Trump, in his first term, kicks off the Artemis program with a thing called the Space Policy Directive #1, which redirected NASA back to the moon as its immediate goal. Space Policy Directive 1 is a few hundred words, the key bit of which is set far-reaching exploration milestones. By 2025, begin crewed missions beyond the moon, including sending humans to an asteroid. By the mid-2030s, send humans to orbit Mars and return them safely to Earth, with this idea that it should be done with commercial partners. And that was really the key break. So the idea was this would be a US project, but it would not be like the government pouring all its money into it. They would create commercial incentive for it to become a commercial opportunity for private organizations. So United States driven, coalition of people signed up to the Artemis Accords, the usual allied nations, and also importantly that it will be supplied and run by commercial and private sector partners.
So this is about 10 years ago. Okay. Interesting. I feel like the political landscape is a little different.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because do you think that the US's fundamental drive to be the Earth's dominant geopolitical force has changed? I mean, the ways and means by which that might be achieved has probably changed, but not the actual underlying motivation.
I don't think that has changed. I am skeptical around this exploration with others. So the international cooperation piece. And I think we've had conversations around like trends towards greater geopolitical fragmentation. We're seeing that already in global current events. I'm curious to see how that mission has evolved and whether there's something more around like ensuring our own sovereignty in volatile times.
It's interesting you mentioned sovereignty, because a lot of the reporting is that the Artemis program is very much not a sovereign exercise. It is a commercial exercise. It's built on the basis that there will be a cislunar economy, and who controls the infrastructure and platforms of that cislunar economy will dominate it. So it's not about sovereignty. It's in a political sense, it's about commercial command.
Yeah, but don't you think those two things are so deeply linked these days? Like, I don't think you can talk about politics without talking about the economic and commercial kind of like considerations.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's an interesting thing to reflect on in the previous space race, which was purely politics, right? It was cultural politics. It was like capitalism is better than communism. And we can prove that by landing someone on the moon first. And so I think this is slightly different, where you're right, it is politics. But the idea is there's going to be business here. We want it to be our business, not Chinese business. That's the motivation for this. Quietly along the way, actually, since 2017, the asteroid thing has been dropped. So there were plans to land humans on an asteroid, and the economics of it haven't worked out. Like the cost of doing that incredibly complex bit of engineering versus the potential benefits just aren't there at the moment. So the focus is on the moon. Again, so the idea is that that you have mandatory commercial partners, mandatory for NASA. They're not allowed to develop and run and operate hardware or platforms or systems themselves. They have to bring in external commercial partners. The idea being that will accelerate development and innovations. And firms are incentivized in the arrangement they have to build components that are reusable. So the idea again is to build an industry here. It's not just to build towards one mission. It's to build towards consistent reusable infrastructure that can sort of continue to go up and down for decades to come. So think about SpaceX's launchable and landable rockets and things like that. Those are endemic of the approach here. We're not doing big bang, we did it, well done, everybody go home, see you again in 10 years. We want something that will go up and down, will work every time, is reusable, etc., etc. So there's a bunch of companies involved. To very quickly rattle through them because there's a long list and it's the usual suspects. Lockheed Martin, they're doing a bunch of stuff around the capsule. You've got Northrop Grumman who are doing lots of stuff on rocket boosters, Rocketdyne doing engines. You've got SpaceX who are doing stuff with the lunar lander they've designed for the Artemis crew. They've also got Blue Origin in there. They're working on a lander as well. There's Maxar Space Systems doing power and propulsion, Axiom Space, Bechtel. A bunch of these different companies, some of which are more established and some of which are relatively new. But the idea is that you are changing the sort of platform dynamics of space. So, some equivalences might be that you're moving from like the early days of the internet, which was largely government driven and was coming out of things like DARPA and was set up in universities, to something that was then the government became a client for the internet. And that's the idea here, is that NASA becomes a client for commercial space services rather than the other way around. So Artemis II its success is good for all of that because it's proven that system works. This isn't just the technology works, it's also this commercial economic arrangement works, and now we can proceed with the rest of the Artemis program. Again, super quickly, what's in plan here. There's Artemis 3 and then there's Artemis 4, which is supposed to be the test landing for sustained human presence on the lunar surface. And then you've got Artemis 5, which should be the final testing, where NASA basically backs off from the whole thing and says, we've now established the infrastructure and the operations. It's now up for these commercial partners to continue to drive the whole thing and make this into a sustainable commercial infrastructure.
So what's the timeline to get from now to 5?
Yeah. Well, Artemis 2 is only 1 year late, which is amazing for a project of that size. So Artemis 4's target is around 2028, so not far away at all. And so Artemis 5, which is where they're supposed to be able to demonstrate that they can land on the moon repeatedly before the end of the decade, 2028 to 2030. So that's within the next 4 years. The moon-based vision is a little vaguer. It's not so clear exactly when that's going to be there. And there's lots of exciting technological development there around robotics and new materials processes and renewable energy and things like that are driving this idea that, again, the biggest problem, to be super clear, with spaceflight is getting stuff off the Earth. Once you're in space, it's complex maths, but in terms of raw energy and effort, it's not as complicated. Getting out of Earth's gravity well is the bit that's expensive and difficult. So the idea is you want to take as little stuff off the Earth as possible and create machines that can, for instance, harvest moon dust and turn it into building material, or can create solar panels out of sintering the naturally available silicon that might be around in the rest of the solar system. So the idea of getting energy systems up there first is really primary, whether it's solar arrays or modular nuclear reactors.
Can I ask you a question? If you were to take a step back and think about, like, as a human being, how you feel about this, what is your reflection on that?
It's an interesting question, because I'm going to admit that I'm dazzled by the spectacle. It's very hard for me, actually. Most things I can be quite critically distant because I am a bit of a nerd. I'm like, yeah, this is great.
Really? I'm struggling with the premise, because it's like, there's a couple different pathways that this is taking me on. One is, if we're making these investments towards space exploration and essentially building up a commercial infrastructure in space, what is that pulling time and attention away from back on planet Earth, where we will still have close to 10 billion people by the year 2050? And there are a lot of problems for us to still solve here. And then the other part of this is a little bit of that manifest destiny thing, right? Like, how much of a right do we really have to be doing this? I'm struggling with, yes, it's super cool from a technological perspective, but you start to talk about, the extraction of materials on the moon. And I'm just thinking, is that good for us? There's this ethical dilemma that I'm really struggling with in this wider like discourse around space exploration.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of whataboutism at all, because I think you can do that for anything. So Artemis so far is expected to have cost $93 billion. And the Iran war so far in 6 weeks has cost $25 billion. So it's cost a quarter of that in 6 weeks.
Which also
right? So,
not a great... Like,
yeah. And to be completely clear, that one I'm not so ambivalent about. But yeah, I wish I had a straight answer for you because I do feel conflicted about it. Because I understand the ethical thing, but also I follow people who are really excited by the science.
And I get that
part.
part.
Is teaching us about physics. That some of the stuff that we're starting to see as weak signals come out of it around robotics and cheaper renewable energy and the ability to do new things with materials.
No, I hear you. It's more just like, I'm just curious as we think about these issues that are quite complex. I think we come up against this in Future's work in general, is there's always going to be a tension around who benefits from what and who gets left behind. Somebody's heaven is another person's hell. And I think that is absolutely the case here. But you're right. There is something to be said about the second order innovation that takes place. And I do think there's something interesting about that. I guess I don't love the key players in the ecosystem right now is maybe where I'll land.
Well, if it makes you any better, Luxembourg are really positioning themselves as a site of space takeoff.
Luxembourg.
Yeah,
all
that's
right.
one of their big economic bets. Well, let's go through the main competitors first. So China have their own program, which mirrors very similarly the US approach, but obviously without the big commercial emphasis. It's a state-funded, state-backed thing. They have a joint agreement with Russia to have a thing called the International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS, with a very, very similar timeline. Chang'e's 4, 5, 6, 7, those missions have already gone ahead. They're now into the idea of starting to get to landing on the moon and starting to build out a base. So the idea is that by 2035, China/Russia have an operatable moon base based around a nuclear reactor, and that expands to the middle of the century with like a lunar economy around it. So capturing asteroids, sending back water and materials and things like that. Chang'e 7 and 8, which are due to launch in the next few years, meant as scouting missions to find the resources necessary to establish a base. That it's certainly estimated to be running cheaper than the US's, so about $2 billion a launch versus Artemis's $4.1 billion a launch. But again, rounding out at around $100 billion. And then you've got some of the smaller players. So India is really betting big on robotics. They want to be a sort of big robotics supplier, but also there's an argument in this which is related to what you were discussing before, where some people think the future of space travel is robotics. It's not sending people into space. There's no need to send humans into space. It introduces a huge degree of risk and the associated cost. So India's betting on entirely robotic spaceflight. But it's very small. They've got $2.4 billion to play with, and they want to get a robot on the moon by 2040. That's the cost of one Chinese launch. Japan's also bumped up investment, similar to quantum, to $6.7 billion over the next few years. And then the Europeans as well have got the European Space Agency. They haven't got explicit plans for a moon base, but they're certainly interested in supporting with infrastructure. So what's it all about, really, is the big question. There is this, there are, at a high level, there are similarities to the last space race between the Soviet Union and America. Only this time it's China and America. But it's interesting that the imperatives are commercial, but there's very little direct commercial benefits. So there's almost no resources on the moon that are justified by the cost of sending a bunch of people up there. There are things like helium-3 and potentially rare earth elements, but they're much cheaper still to get on Earth. There's obviously some good science to be done, so you can do experiments and techniques and things that you can't do in Earth's atmosphere or in Earth's gravity well. Biological experiments, for example, that can be isolated far away. So really what this is a speculative bet from both sides that there is a prospective cislunar economy that will emerge by the end of the century. And all of these aren't about really saying we're going to return this in much investment by the next decade, but saying we're going to have all of the pieces in place. We're going to have the platforms, the software, the systems, the infrastructure. By establishing those first, similar to any big moves in tech, we'll be able to define the regulations, the way that it works, to then, once that economy starts to emerge, once the cost of space travel gets cheaper, once the cost of renewable energy, once the cost of getting things on the moon gets cheaper, or we can manufacture things from the moon, that growth curve, you've established the baseline for it and you own it and it's your standards. And what's really interesting is none of this stuff, or very little of this stuff, according to some of the folks I was reading, falls under the terms of the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty we've mentioned a couple of times was done in the 60s, and it was about preventing nukes going into orbit, basically. I don't think the writers of the Outer Space Treaty ever imagined that there would be, Silicon Valley startups sending modular nuclear reactors into space to set up moon bases. Similar to the beginning of shipping, whoever builds the ports, whoever charts the routes, whoever builds the maps, they get to be the big colonizers and make all the money. Similar to railways across the United States didn't make any money at first, but eventually they established the infrastructure that allowed business to grow, which allowed for them to then get wealthy off it.
I'm trying so hard to find the positive spin here, because it is a good challenge for us to do that, right? And to not always go doomsday.
Yeah. But what do you think the doomsday is? I mean, what do you think the negative is?
Well, I don't love that you just said that they're imagining being able to do things like biological experiments, because do we really need to bring Ebola to the moon? I think this is what I'm worried about is there are not regulatory safeguards for this stuff. And so this is the wild, wild west for innovation. I mean, it's the current administration's dream scenario. And I also understand your argument about why it's good for innovation. And I'm also I don't love who's doing the innovating. So, you know what I mean? So I don't know. And then I guess the other part of this is when it becomes more, I don't know, commonplace. What else does it signal for people, for humanity, right? What other, I guess, futures or imaginaries does that open us up to? That's what I'm curious about. And if we go back to an argument around the preservation of our planet, I think that's what I'm concerned about. Is it all right, well, we don't really need to worry about planet Earth because, screw resource constraints. We have other resources in other parts of the galaxy.
The Apollo program cost $290 billion, so approximately 0.35% of the US's GDP, whereas Artemis cost 0.1%.
But see, you're making this an economic argument, right? Versus there's this is not purely about economic.
There's some really interesting assumptions in there, isn't there? Because I will acknowledge that I really struggle not to see humans in space. If I was to suggest a counterfactual where we've developed the ability to get off Earth and then we go, yeah, we're never going to do that, and never do it. And that's it. We just set up 100,000 satellites, lock ourselves out. I can't actually imagine that. That to me isn't entertainable. And that's probably a product of something that we've talked about a lot before, which is that we're just surrounded by visions of humans in space all the time, from science fiction and everything else. But also I don't imagine a near future of any sort where we've got hundreds of thousands or millions of people in space. I just imagine it as an extension of our techno-scientific system physically off the surface of the Earth, past the satellite range, into moons, asteroids, Mars, and so on and so forth. Maybe there are some people up there, but it's largely scientific and technical exploration. And I make no excuses for the people involved. And this is something that you said, that people get their kids together to watch, because it's something that makes you, there's the literal sublime, the technological sublime is a part of spaceflight.
I think there's something really cool about understanding that there's a vast expanse out there and that we haven't got it all sorted out. Right? That there's still something to be discovered and explored. There is some magic in our lives. You bring this back to an economic argument, and I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in what does it start to signal for people for what they are allowed to imagine for themselves and for others. And I think that's where it starts to get a little bit hairy for me, because no one's going to sit there and say, well, my tax dollars, some people will say my tax dollars are going here versus here. Whenever we do things like this, whenever we test a new boundary, one of the things it's doing is allowing us to imagine what else could be, right? And it's giving us kind of the next frontier for where our imaginations can take us, what is possible, right? And so you've now just kind of this entire thing has blown the door open for what it means to be a human being and where our resources, our capabilities, our innovation, our technology, where all of that goes. And I guess my thing is where will people go with that, right? We had a conversation ages ago during the Good Futurist episode about sometimes the work is impactful in that it creates a discursive moment, and that in itself is enough. And so what are the discursive moments that are being created by work like this? So it's not necessarily for me an economic argument necessarily. It's not we're wasting resources and we shouldn't be and bah humbug. It's what else are we allowing people to imagine? And it's not always going to be a good thing. And who is doing the imagining? Because we've opened up this door.
Yeah. And actually similar to a lot of waves of technology, everything from incredibly prosaic things like 3D cinema to so-called artificial intelligence. The second wave is sort of the one where it gets locked in. the first wave is what's this going to be like? And it, we send someone to the moon and everyone goes, this wasn't worth it. And then over decades, people go, we can make it worth it if we do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're locked into basically big tech Silicon Valley visions of space travel.
And that's exactly,
Which is why, again, I think
Yeah.
it's an extension of our existing techno-scientific regime, just further.
which
'Cause
is
it's
what
the
I
same
don't
people
love
making the
about
same
it.
kind of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we need trillionaires? Anyway, friend, thank you for bumming me out on a Friday. I love it.
I'm really sorry. I mean, I do feel very
I'm
divided
excited
about it.
and I am just torn. I'm a complex human being. I contain multitudes,
I hope that Luxembourg really get their shit together, because it'd be
You
great if
think
they
so?
become the dominant
is,
force.
is the future of humanity resting on Luxembourg's
Well,
shoulder?
this is perhaps like something that we need to articulate, is I don't think that people are tying up their sense of what the future of the human race is with spaceflight in the same way they would have been in the 60s. Then it was like moon bases and Martians and aliens and the golden age of science fiction, as Star Wars was around the corner and all that stuff.
Yeah,
And we were about
yeah.
to enter a whole new, we're literally the space age. We've done the industrial age, we're into the space age. And obviously that sort of crackled out over, a couple of decades and sort of drew to a halt. This doesn't feel, to me at least, culturally the same thing. People are like, wow, that's cool, in the same way that people have been watching SpaceX launches on Twitter for the last decade or so. But it is a significant milestone in the expansion of our existing techno-scientific order. But it doesn't feel, to me at least, when I hear about what people felt about the 60s and the moon landing, that
Yeah.
enormous existential sense of, the blue marble and seeing the
Wow,
Earth
yeah.
from space and we're all one people and all that stuff. That doesn't feel here. It's just like, it is socioeconomic commercial dominance, but there's some good, useful science along the way. And again, I'm just going to be clear, and it's probably just my own personality. I think it's also, in the literal non-American sense of the word, awesome, as in full of awe. Like, I think it's awesome to get stuff off the
Do you
Earth
think we
into space.
overuse that term?
Massively overuse that term.
Or we're just very joyful people?
Well, that's Artemis. I doubt that we'll have as many sort of updates on Artemis over the next few weeks, because those things tend to move at a bit of a slower pace.
Well, thank you for your story.
I will see you later. Toodles.
Sounds good. Toodles.